In the early 16th century, a Catholic monk began to openly oppose the Pope and certain Catholic Church teachings. He mailed his list of grievances to the Archbishop of Mainz and then nailed them to the door of the church in Wittenberg. The man, of course, is Martin Luther. But it was after this whole kickoff of the Protestant Reformation that another key figure emerged out of this context, and his name was Galileo Galilei. Building on Copernicus' theory of heliocentrism, Galileo built a telescope and began to make certain observations that, to him, confirmed that heliocentrism was in fact true. But the scientific community at the time wasn't so convinced. They believed that Galileo lacked hard evidence to prove that heliocentrism was true. This is the fact that the sun is at the center of the solar system and not the Earth. Well, what happened after that was Galileo became extremely more convinced and combative in his views about heliocentrism. And at first, the Catholic Church did not condemn Galileo for his view of heliocentrism. In fact, Robert Bellarmine, who was a theologian of the Catholic Church, encouraged the Catholic Church officials not to condemn Galileo, and also encouraged Galileo not to be so dogmatic about being right about heliocentrism, but rather encouraged Galileo to put it forward more as a hypothesis until he could put more evidence to prove that heliocentrism was true. Of course, Galileo didn't really take Bellarmine's advice. Instead, he kept insisting that heliocentrism was a fact of nature and that Scripture needed to be reinterpreted to fit heliocentrism. And of course, what he was referring to was the various passages in the Old Testament that talk about the earth being fixed, set on the foundation, set on the pillars, this idea that the earth does not move, cannot be moved, verses like that many church officials at the time interpreted as being the earth being fixed, stationary, non-movable, and that everything else revolved around the earth. Galileo insisted that it was the sun that was stationary and didn't move, and that the earth orbited around the sun. And so he insisted that based on the scientific evidence that Scripture be reinterpreted and that the theologians were wrong. Now, normally, this would not be a tremendous problem, but from the Catholic Church's perspective, when we kind of take a step back and look at it from how they would have seen it, this was a serious claim that Galileo was making. And of course, coming on the heels of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation and Luther's bold stance about reinterpreting Scripture, you can imagine that the Catholic Church was a little bit hesitant to allow people to just openly speak about their contradiction and conflict with church dogma. And so this was not the best approach for Galileo to take, especially given the decades-long battle that the Catholic Church had just had and was still having in many ways, with the Protestant reformers. So Galileo's insistence that he was right and that Scripture be reinterpreted did not do him any favors. And so eventually what happened was in 1616, the Roman Catholic Church issued an injunction that didn't condemn heliocentrism as heresy, but rather simply as false and contrary to divine scriptures. And that was until Galileo corrected his view and came more in line with church teaching about the nature of the earth and its movement or lack thereof. And so this injunction was in place in 1616, and then a couple of things happened that were really, really interesting. What happened was the friend of Galileo, Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, became pope. And so Galileo thought, now that he had a friend as pope, he could kind of have a little bit more freedom in speaking about heliocentrism and start teaching it again because his friend became pope. However, Barberini never lifted the 1616 injunction that prevented Galileo from talking about, discussing, writing about, and teaching heliocentrism. And so naturally, once Galileo felt more freedom and was openly talking about it again, Cardinal Barberini, who was then Pope Urban VIII, ordered an investigation into Galileo to find out if he had violated the injunction. And of course, he was found to be in violation of it. And so as a result of being in violation of the injunction, he was placed under house arrest, where he would live the remainder of his life until he was 78. And in 1642, he passed away. And so that's kind of the brief story and overview of what happened with Galileo. It's not really so much the dramatic affair that Hollywood and other people who see science and faith in conflict have painted it out to be. There was a lot going on historically in that context that when you look at Galileo's situation contextually, you can see why the church responded the way they did. Maybe it wasn't the way they should have responded, but it certainly becomes a little bit more understandable with everything that was going on in that context with the Protestant Reformation and Luther's bold stance. It certainly makes sense why the church responded the way they did to Galileo. Also, Galileo didn't do himself many favors, being very adamant and staunch in his position that he was right and the church was wrong, and that the science proved that the theologians were wrong and the theologians need to reinterpret scripture and that their interpretation was wrong. This kind of language was very, very sensitive at the time, and Galileo just wasn't sensitive to that fact, and he should have been. And I think Bellarmine did his best to kind of act as an arbiter between the church and Galileo, and had Galileo actually listened to Bellarmine and just said that this is a hypothesis and done more research and presented more evidence and taken a slower, longer-term view, he may have actually successfully convinced the church of heliocentrism, and this whole affair would have never happened. So I think the lesson that we can take away from this is that when science and the church, or science and the Christian faith, or science and religion, or in particular the Christian religion, when they seem to conflict or they come at odds with one another, the best thing to do, obviously, is to slow down and to take your time and to try to patiently understand where the other side is coming from. I think a lot of times we paint the church as kind of this place where there are people who are power-hungry, authoritarians who want to be in charge and tell everyone what's right and wrong, and the scientists as these good guys who are only out to learn the truth, and the church is there to suppress that truth, and the scientists just want to know discover facts and stuff like that. And that's not really the case. The church would have been more than open and receptive to heliocentrism had the context of the Protestant Reformation was not so fresh in their minds and on their plates at the time. Also, the scientists, this idea of scientists being just want to discover truth. Again, Galileo did not do his due diligence in presenting his arguments. And the scientific community at the time rejected Galileo's conclusions based on a lack of evidence. And so it was actually Galileo who was kind of pushing forward this idea that he was right and heliocentrism was true. He was right, but he didn't have enough evidence yet to show that he was right. And so the scientific community at the time was urging caution with Galileo not to push it forward so vehemently. And so Galileo had a bit of an agenda as well. He wanted to put forward his ideas without hard evidence. And so he was simply being urged to take caution and go slow. The church wasn't trying to be authoritative and squelch science and suppress scientific knowledge. It was encouraging Galileo to come up with more evidence, do more research, and take it slow. But he didn't want to do that. And so by not taking it slow and listening to Bellarmine and the church and present better evidence for his position, and he just wanted to be right, then what we had was the situation between Galileo and the church, and that's what ended up unfolding. And so I think the lesson here for us to learn is that when science and faith, or science and the church at least, come into some type of conflict or a situation where they're butting heads, the important thing to remember is that when we work together to actually discover the truth, then the best possible situation and scenario will happen. That's the best way for science to advance, and the best way for the church to advance is when science and faith are working in harmony with each other, and understanding one another, patient with one another, and working in cooperation with one another, and not opposing each other. When we oppose each other, science and the church oppose each other, bad things always happen. But when we support each other, we work in harmony with one another, then the best results will always come forward. So that's our podcast for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. So glad that you're here. If you have a comment or a question or a suggestion, you can leave it in the comment section below, or you can send us an email. Our email address is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. Also, you can check out our website. We have lots of resources on there. We also have a blog, and we post articles weekly. You can check those out. Our website address is scienceandfaith.de, and be sure to check that out. We look forward to hearing your guys' comments, questions, and suggestions. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Science and Faith Podcast.